Question number 1. How do you deal with contamination?
So I know contamination is a really common and popular word in the SM world. And what it implies is that there's an environment where a child is relatively stuck. So they see that an environment as a place where they don't talk. I don't talk there. The most common contaminated environment, if you want to call it that, is school. So that's where a lot of the kids will have the most difficulty in terms of making progress. And the word contaminated, in my mind, I'm not a big fan of that word. And I know that it's out there, and I see it as an area you're stuck. And so it's not an area you just like ignore. It's an area that you assess and understand, why is that child or teen stuck in that environment? Why do they see themselves mute in that environment? Sometimes it's really as simple as, everyone knows I don't talk there. Not that that's simple, but what I mean is that's the explanation. It's certainly not simple. I don't talk there, so everyone's going to make a big deal if I do talk. And so that can lead to, I just stay mute because I don't want to bring attention to myself, especially knowing so many of our kids and teens are socially anxious. So you're bringing attention to yourself if all of a sudden you start talking. So the way we handle that word or that situation is, when we're assessing an individual's why they're not talking in an environment, or why they're having difficulty communicating in general, and what are their baseline stage. And in this case, it usually means they're nonverbal. They may not be overly initiative, maybe they are, but they're nonverbally responsive. Maybe they're quietly verbal with one or two, I'm not really sure, but they're more stuck in that environment. That's where we have to focus our treatment. That's where we start with their baseline stage. That's where we train the teachers to begin, rather than kind of pushing or encouraging to speak if they're not yet ready. One of the things that's really a difficulty is the idea that selective mutism is about just not speaking. And therefore, the approach is, let's do whatever we can to encourage the child to speak. And we often will put it on the child and say, listen, you need to be courageous and brave to talk. But what if that child can't? So I don't want to say that they're stuck there. It's more or less they're not able to at that time. So it really comes down to tailoring strategies and interventions to the child, meet them where they're at, talk to the child about it. Again, I often, work with families where when they come to the Smart Center, they'll say, no one really ever talked to my child about it. We didn't talk about it. We kind of ignored it. Or we only really did focus on trying to get them to talk because they seem fine everywhere else, or they seem fine. So the key to this is knowing where they're having the most difficulty, or the difficulty in general, and starting to develop a treatment plan that will accommodate them with their starting point, and then alter strategies and interventions. So contaminated often means they're professional mimes in an environment where they look comfortable. They can kind of run around, smile, interact perhaps, but they're mute. This is where the transitional stage of communication is really, really powerful. Using purposeful strategies such as the use of a verbal intermediary in a very structured way. Sometimes it's starting out of the room. Sometimes it's moving in the room in a very controlled manner. Sometimes it's using sounds to words, all the way up to a very ritualistic unlearning mute behavior by shaping sounds into words. Our children tend to feel out of control. So much of SCAT, this CBT-based program, is all about providing control to them. So even in an environment where they're stuck, quote unquote, contaminated, you have to talk to the child about it. The visual of the bridge is beautiful because they can see where they are, and we can start step by step by helping them unlearn their conditioned mutism. And that involves training parents, but it also involves training school staff and educating others to meet them where they're at and get them involved. This question doesn't focus on it, but there's something called acknowledgement, assessment, and taking action. I call it AAA. And acknowledge it means I know something's difficult and I can rate that difficulty, assess it, and now there's going to be action taken. So every child, whether they're relating to a scary feeling or it's hard to do as they get older, needs to acknowledge that this is hard or scary. Maybe it's using words. Maybe it's pointing or nodding. Maybe it's turning to a peer and saying the word yes quietly, whatever it might be, but it's acknowledging it and then trusting that child while they assess their difficulty, not disrespecting them by saying, no, you can do it. You can be brave to talk. There's kids ready to be verbal, but there are a lot of kids, and we see a lot of those kids that are not ready to talk yet. But trust me,
Right.
they will.
So real quick before we move on to question number 2, contamination in this context doesn't refer to like something being dirty or polluted or something along those lines.
If you think of the word contaminated, it implies that that environment is like discombobulated, as you'd say.
Okay.
Doesn't mean it's
Okay.
dirty. It just means it's like all
Right.
kind of confusing and they're
Okay.
stuck. It's like, I don't want to use the word,
Out
so
of sorts. It's
at
not.
a sort, you're stuck
Yeah.
there. It's like there's something
Okay.
holding them up. And
Makes sense.
so if you think about the social communication bridge and you respect where their starting point is, and then you develop strategies
Mhm.
by taking them from their baseline up and training others to implement and talking to the child about it and the
Mhm.
teen, then
Mhm.
you will overcome it. I've never had a child I've worked with where they could not overcome it in an environment if we worked with that child and family and we worked with the school, because it's really
Okay.
unlearning their conditioned mutism. And you know what? There are some children that have to go through a process of writing letters to friends, even if they never send it, for example, what they'd want those kids to know if they heard their voice, or would you help me, do these games or strategies to help me be able to progress into speech, or however we write that or they write it. And it doesn't mean they send it, but it's really about meeting that child where they're at and helping them understand what is it about that environment that makes them so uncomfortable. And sometimes it's teachers misunderstanding. And once you train teachers, all of a sudden, by educating teachers, the child feels more understood and meets them where they're at. And that contaminated environment becomes very uncontaminated. And then they begin to make progress quite easily. So I think it's really getting
Mhm.
all your ducks in a row from every perspective.